So Samsung finally did it. We knew it was coming. Last year they didn't release a Note, but added S Pen compatibility to the S21 Ultra, and now they've finally merged the S and Note series to give us this, the new Galaxy S22 Ultra. So there's no more debate anymore. This is the one true powerhouse in the Samsung family. In this video I'm going to be testing out everything that's new with the phone, how it compares to last year's S21 Ultra, and also the last Note phone that was released, the Note 20 Ultra. Last year, the S21 Ultra was basically as good or better in every way than the S20 Ultra. This year, that's not the case. There are some things that are simply better on the older phones compared to the new S22 Ultra that you should bear in mind, and it makes choosing between these phones a whole lot more interesting. Of course, we'll cover all of the spec and feature differences in depth, and we'll also be answering the question, is the S22 Ultra the new best smartphone on the market? We'll start with the unboxing, which these days does not take very long at all. We simply have the usual paperwork, SIM ejector tool, the USB-C charging cable, and of course the phone itself. I went for the Phantom Black version, mainly so we can compare to the black S21 and Note 20 Ultras, but I think I'll get the green version in for when we compare this to the iPhone 13 Pro Max. You get a lovely and smooth matte finish on all colours this year, but this is a slightly lighter shade of black than on last year's S21 Ultra. I think both S-series phones are a step up from the glossy finishes that came on the Note though, which are just spoiled so easily by fingerprints. The biggest design change is the new boxy squared off design, which looks much more like the Galaxy Notes we've seen in the past. Now this really seems to split people 50-50, but for me personally, I actually prefer the rounded edges on the S21 Ultra. I just find it much more aesthetically pleasing. The second major design aspect is the camera layout, and I've got to say once again, I prefer the S21 Ultra design. It's essentially the S21 layout, but with the camera bump removed, a change I initially thought I wanted, but there's just something about having this many lenses that I think looks better when sat flush as part of a camera bump. And maybe it's just that we're more used to camera bumps now. I will say though that the S22 Ultra feels nicer in the hand because it's nowhere near as top heavy as the S21 Ultra is. The new phone is a tiny bit smaller than last year's, though about the same thickness and weight. It's just not quite as thin and light as the Note 20 Ultra. We have the same sized 6.8-inch display, although it curves a lot more this year than before, which for me has meant a noticeable increase in accidental screen touches. I'd personally much rather have a flat display, or at least the S21 Ultra's slighter curve instead, but this is once again a problem for the S22 Ultra, like it is on the Note 20 Ultra. I don't really think this gives much of a smaller bezel improvement either, at least not enough to justify the practical handicap. The side bezels are thinner the more curved the glass is, but there's very little in it, and I don't think it's worth it. With such similar dimensions, there isn't really much to separate the ergonomic experience using these phones. They're all huge displays and tough to use completely one-handed. The S Pen helps out with this, the Note's signature feature, which this year comes included in the body of the S22 Ultra, so this is really a key distinguishing feature between the phones. Both the S22 and Note 20 Ultra have the S Pen included, but you'll need one of those bulky phone cases to carry around an S Pen with your S21 Ultra. You get the full range of features of the pen for the S22 Ultra, including air gestures, and the latency is also much lower now at just 2.8 milliseconds. So there's a noticeable improvement for those of you who strive for that lifelike pen-to-paper experience. In the past, the S Pen has been the main feature separating the S and Note series lineups, so now Samsung's flagship model comes with it, whether you'll actually end up using it or not. Other changes I noticed were in the vibration motor, which is different this year. There's not so much a change in the general haptic feedback using the device, but the vibration alert for incoming messages and calls is considerably weaker this year, to the point where you can actually miss those calls. Some people may prefer this less aggressive vibration when the phone's left on a hard surface, but there's a toggle you can turn on to add a sound to the vibration, which can help a bit if you find this a problem. So there are some smaller ergonomic differences there, as there are with durability. The S22 Ultra is the first smartphone to use Gorilla Glass Victus Plus, which is supposed to have improved scratch resistance and drop protection versus the predecessor, which you find on the other two phones. However, because of that increased curvature on the front glass, and perhaps the new boxy design as well, initial durability tests are showing the S22 Ultra is actually more prone to breaking. I can understand the physics behind these results, but you should also take them with a pinch of salt. A phone case is going to all but rectify these types of issues, and if you drop any glass rectangles on the floor, you run the risk of breaking them. Otherwise, we have pretty much the same aluminium frame as last year, though remember we have the superior stainless steel on the Note 20 Ultra, and the water resistance is unchanged, with an IP68 rating. With almost every major Samsung flagship release, the bar is raised for a smartphone display, and they've done it once again with the S22 Ultra. Most of the specs are the same. We get a dynamic AMOLED 2x display with a Quad HD resolution and a fast 120Hz refresh rate. The refresh rate is variable on the S series phones, and can go as low as 1Hz on the new S22, but it means there's more of a noticeable step up coming from the Note 20 Ultra, which can only use the high refresh rate at 1080p resolution. The ultrasonic fingerprint sensor is the same as last year, and is still very consistent and reliable. It's worth noting this is the second gen sensor compared to the Note 20 Ultra, which isn't quite as fast as on the newer phones. But the S22 Ultra's main display upgrade is in the peak brightness, which has been increased to an industry-leading 1750 nits, which is just insane. Now it's important to remember how the brightness scale works, so the difference at the peak end isn't perhaps as big as those numbers would suggest. In fact, I didn't see a big improvement with HDR content or in bright sunlight, not even compared to the Note 20 Ultra. However, just manually increasing the brightness indoors gave a massive difference in the max brightness levels. I've never seen a smartphone display anywhere near this bright indoors. Colours are rich and vivid as always, so as a movie watching or a gaming display, it doesn't get much better than this. One downgrade I noticed is with the speakers though, which are considerably quieter than on both the S21 and Note 20 Ultras, so that's something to watch out for if you watch a lot of films or game with the built-in speakers. For me, this display would be almost perfect if only it were flat instead of curved, but I wouldn't be surprised to see the S22 Ultra still at the top spot for smartphone displays at the end of 2022. The phones are all running the latest One UI 4.1 software on Android 12, which means they all benefit from new Android features like Material U, creating unique colour palettes based on your wallpaper. Since the software is the same, the user experience is very similar for these phones. Again, I would mention that it's the S Pen that can really change how you interact with the phone. One UI 4.1 introduces an improved version of RAM+, where you can now add up to 8GB of virtual RAM. Most people can ignore this, but it's interesting because the physical RAM is actually lower this year at up to 12GB compared to 16 with the S21 Ultra. Honestly, this won't matter to the vast majority of people, but for those with a unique use case, such as needing to keep many apps open at once, you could make an argument for getting the older S21 Ultra instead. Storage is another difference, and only the new S22 Ultra offers a 1TB storage option. This is the faster UFS 3.1 storage on the newer S models, but the Note is unique in that it's the only one to offer expandable storage via microSD card. This is an excellent feature that I wish Samsung never got rid of, but if you're someone who needs a lot of storage on their phone, you have to make the right decision at purchase with the S series phones. But with the Note you've got the flexibility to change this up later with a microSD card. The hardware difference affecting most of the day-to-day use though is of course the chipset, where the phones are each separated by a new generation for performance. Incidentally, I have the Exynos models here in the UK, but fortunately for us, those massive performance gap issues from the Snapdragon variant seems to be a thing of the past, and most of the tests nowadays show much more similar performance, with strengths and weaknesses shown in each chipset. If you look at the Geekbench scores, you'll see quite a big step up moving from the Note to the S21 Ultra, and a more modest increase moving to the latest gen S22 Ultra. But when you look at these graphics scores, this is where you really see a big step up in performance for the new phone. This was confirmed again in the 3D wildlife test, which showed a huge 10 frames per second increase for the S22 Ultra compared to last year's phone, so you should see a significant improvement with high-end gaming. I also noticed the S22 Ultra recorded the lowest temperatures and the smallest battery drop during these tests, which bodes well for efficiency too, so gamers especially should expect noticeably better performance from the latest phone. As for the general day-to-day use, it's pretty much the same story. Yes, the S22 Ultra is technically faster here as well, but you really won't notice this as much with things like opening apps and loading web pages. I think the main thing to consider is longevity. Not just that the newer chipsets will perform better over time, but also think about how long each of these phones will be supported. The newest phones now get 4 years of support from Samsung, but this means that buying one right now will give you 3 years left for an S21 Ultra, but only 1 year for a Note 20 Ultra. I think the Note 20 Ultra is perfectly capable in terms of its hardware in 2022. It's fast and it has 5G support just like the other two, but it may be too late to get one now if you plan on keeping it for a few years. The final performance aspect to consider is the battery life, and this gave me the most surprising results. The S models have 5000 mAh batteries, and as expected, both outlasted the Note 20 Ultra. I took these phones on an extensive camera shoot, starting the day at 100% battery life, using the phones in the exact same way, and ended the day with these results. So I was surprised to see the S21 Ultra outperform its successor, and perhaps that's to do with the chip running faster in the new model. but repeat usage tests consistently gave me this result. Remember that the screen on time here is mainly useful as a relative comparison and not a definitive figure to assign to battery life, because it all depends on how you use the phone. I can extend all of these beyond well over 12 hours by binging videos and not touching the display, so it really can vary. But the best performer for battery life is still the S21 Ultra. In terms of charging, the S22 Ultra does have an advantage in that it supports 45-watt charging, versus 25 watts in the other two phones. Of course, that doesn't mean you should expect almost twice as fast charging. That's not how the correlation between power and speed works, and the real-life results are far less exciting. The chargers don't come in the box, so you'd need to buy that 45-watt charger separately anyway, and you can see from these results that there's not much in it when it comes to charging speeds. I'm sure most of you are here for the cameras though, and despite a seemingly very similar spec sheet from last year, there are in fact new sensors and processing tweaks to change things up. Interestingly, not all of this results in improvements though, as we're about to see. First of all, I should say that this camera is on the whole excellent. Images are sharp and have that typical striking Samsung look with high contrast, saturation and vibrancy. In fact, it's been dialed up a little compared to last year. This is one of the most versatile cameras on any smartphone right now, with a great main, ultra-wide, and two very impressive telephoto lenses. The zoom performance in particular is fantastic this year, and something I'll come back to in more detail later. So for the vast majority of people picking up this phone, I'm sure you're going to love the camera. Those that might not are current owners of the S21 Ultra, and after taking hundreds of photos and videos, I've noticed some recurring themes when comparing these phones. Take this shot of the bike here and look in the corners, or really any of the outer part of the image, and you'll notice that it's actually incredibly soft. Now I could have picked almost any picture taken on the main lens to show this off, because it's something I consistently saw with the S22 Ultra. Side by side with the S21 Ultra, there are lots of similarities in these photos, but the edges and corners are much sharper on last year's phone. If we switch over to the Note 20 Ultra now, okay, there are other issues here like HDR, which is nowhere near as good as on the two newer phones. But again, the Note doesn't have that heavy softening around the edges. It'll be interesting to see if this is a byproduct of the new larger sensor in the main lens, or whether this is something Samsung can improve on with future software updates. But it means for now at least, I prefer a lot of the shots coming out of the S21 Ultra instead. Okay, so softening is one issue, and the next is HDR. The S22 Ultra photos have such high contrast because the black levels are so low, resulting in very dark shadows that actually end up losing detail. Again, the Note struggles on the highlights, and in general doesn't match up with HDR. We touched on this earlier, and it really shows the generational leap the S models have taken with dynamic range. But zooming in on those darker shadow areas, you can see how much more detail is captured by both the Note and S21 Ultra, as well as the S22's oversaturation. Some of you may have actually spotted this in the bike shot earlier, and the dark shadows issue is perhaps easier to see here. The S22 Ultra's processing sometimes works well to create striking images, but it's often just too over the top. And the third recurring issue I found with the S22 Ultra is in the consistency between the lenses, especially from the ultra-wide. Just look at the warm orange colours in this ultra-wide shot here, and notice the massive white balance shift to cooler tones in this main lens shot, taken just a couple of seconds later. Then switching to the Tele lens, it's cooler still. Just look at the darker blue in the sky. So the consistency in colours and white balance between lenses isn't very good. Here's the same ultra-wide shot taken on the S21 Ultra, and now the wide shot, which immediately you can tell has a much more consistent colour temperature. So these are the three S21 Ultra shots, these are the Note 20 Ultra shots, which are also relatively consistent, and now back to the S22 Ultra. And again, this inconsistency was a recurring theme and not just a one-off. Now I wanted to start with those points because they're the most typical and consistent issues I encountered. They largely affect photos taken in good lighting on the main lens, which is the most common scenario for taking photos on a smartphone. However, the S22 Ultra does have some clear advantages over the other two phones, and one of my favourites is with zoom photography. I think the first thing to point out is that there is a huge step up going from the Note to either of the S models. The Note only has one 5x optical zoom lens, competing against the two telephoto lenses at 3 and 10x on the S series phones, and you quickly realise that the range of high quality zoom is so much greater when you've got that dual optical zoom. With this 3x zoom shot, the Note has to zoom digitally on the main lens, and therefore the quality is severely degraded by comparison. The Note's Tele lens only kicks in at 5x zoom and above, so now it's the S models that have to zoom digitally, and the Note has an advantage over a brief zoom range. And then of course at 10x, the S models are back to optical zooming, where the Note is now struggling to keep up. And going beyond this, the Note quickly drops off in quality, but the S models, and the 22 especially, have far superior performance. They can also reach 100x zoom, whereas the Note tops out at 50x. The S22's 10x lens is a significant improvement from last year, not just with the sharpness and detail, but with the colour too. The S21 is washed out by comparison. The zoom capability really is astonishingly good now, and as someone who wouldn't normally bother much with zoom photography, the S22 Ultra has reached a level now where I'm encouraged to take more zoom shots because of how capable this phone is. I should also mention the 100x zoom feature again, and I want to take you from the ultra wide shot all the way through to 100x zoom just to show you how far away the subject was from where I was standing. I could see something in the building in the distance, but couldn't tell what it was, but zooming in 100x on the phone let me see that it was in fact wind turbines. So as a tool, it's an impressive, albeit somewhat creepy feature. But the image quality, though perhaps slightly sharper in detail than on the S21 Ultra, is still not really good enough for any useful photos at this kind of distance. It's still a bit of a pain to frame your shot, even with the steadying feature, and the AI processing the phones use to resolve detail like text still results in that smeared, watercolour-like effect, so it's not a deal-breaker feature. A couple of new features this year are first of all a new anti-reflective coating on the camera lens. So you can see this glare that's affecting the Note and S21 Ultras actually isn't present in the S22 Ultra shot, so that seems to be working well so far. And the second is Detail Enhancer, which is a feature you can turn on within the high-res mode on the camera app. It takes a really long time to process your image, so it's not usually going to be worth your time. But if you zoom in close to images, you can see that it does a good job of enhancing extra intricate details. The S22 Ultra's new larger sensor helps improve low-light photography too, and I noticed two main things. One, the night mode shots are faster to take because they don't need as long an exposure time. And two, that you barely ever need to switch to night mode now because the normal photo mode does such a good job. Sometimes a better job, in fact. The phone applies night mode processing to low-light images automatically, so now you don't need to switch modes, you can snap shots faster, and you typically capture a more realistic image with naturally dark shadows as opposed to artificially brightened ones. So I often preferred the normal mode photos, although you will often notice sharper details, and in particular less noise if you look closely at the night mode shots. So I think night mode still has its place, but it's really best in extreme low light situations. As for image quality, it really wasn't the huge step up I was expecting above the other phones though. I'd occasionally see changes like brighter highlights, though not always, but there was typically reduced noise, although I'd normally need to zoom in quite a lot to see the improvement. The Note actually did really well here, and produced the sharpest and most detailed image, but it also took the longest exposure time to achieve this. You can tell by looking at the motion blur difference in these photos, and the S22 Ultra was the fastest and also has the least noise. So I think all of this highlights how the phones perform differently, and there are definitely some improvements, but I don't think owners of the older two phones really need to be jealous when it comes to low light. Samsung claimed the biggest leap in video technology yet, and the new auto frame rate detection is supposed to greatly improve low light video. This is the S21 Ultra footage, and now here's the S22 video. So I can definitely see a massive improvement with detail and noise reduction, and it's the best by far. Interestingly, the Note actually performed better than the S21 Ultra here, and I actually found this with a lot of the still shots too, so the Note still has pretty great low light performance. There isn't really a big video improvement in good lighting though, and in fact I prefer the video coming from both the Note and the S21 Ultra. I've got no complaints with stability or HDR, those are both pretty great, but just like we saw with photos earlier, look at the softening around the edges here. In fact, if we freeze frame for a second, you can see it's not only soft, but noisy as well, and this is with great lighting during the day. I was recording with the Note at the same time as this and could immediately tell the difference. I mean, just look at the same frame taken on the Note 20 Ultra, how much sharper those edges are. Here's the side by side, and this should really tell you that the S22 Ultra has some issues to work out on that main lens. I also tested against the S21 Ultra and saw the exact same thing. I've cropped the videos so you can view them side by side and see the S22's issues in real time, and the S21 is just miles better in quality. I really hope this is something Samsung can fix through software, but we're already over a month later, and this is really letting the S22 Ultra down. The S22 Ultra's portrait mode really impressed me though, and the cutout it creates for subjects is perhaps the best I've seen on any smartphone. Not just for people, but for pets and objects too. It uses a new AI stereo depth mapping tech for this, which also helps with creating a more natural, gradual blur for the surroundings, and this was evident to me when compared against the S21 and Note 20 Ultras. The S21 was pretty close, but the colours weren't as accurate. It's actually the Note that has the best colour and exposure for human subjects. The Note's portraits are obviously different in that the crop on the lens isn't as severe, but it's also the poorest by some margin. It doesn't have the same quality and accuracy for the cutout, the sharpness isn't as good, and the blur effect isn't as natural either. So an overall win for the S22 Ultra. Moving to the front camera, the selfies on the S22 Ultra were fantastic. Again, I think the best on any smartphone right now. The Note struggles on the colour more, is a bit softer, though arguably more realistic, but the contrast is a bit high. The S21 is much closer to the S22, and actually has the brightest exposure without going over the top. But the colours are slightly better on the S22, the contrast is more natural, and there's a bit more detail as well. This all carries over to the portrait mode too, but I'd also say that the S22 Ultra's blur effect looks the best. Samsung have really stepped up their depth mapping tech this year. I also want to mention the high-res selfie mode, which normally I'd tell you is not worth the larger file size and slower capture time, but I think it looks really good this year. Mainly, it isn't as overly sharpened, so textures like hair look more natural and realistic. I think this shows why Samsung by default turn on beauty smoothing for normal selfies. The colours are more accurate here too, they're slightly pink in the normal selfie mode. Plus, I think the default wider angle looks better, and is a bit too zoomed in otherwise. You can choose this for normal selfies as well, but the main point is that the high-res mode is actually worth using this year. And finally we have selfie videos, and there's a clear step up in quality. Stability is really the only thing I can say was great on all three phones. The S22 and 21 Ultra videos were filmed at the exact same time, so there's a more direct comparison there, and you can see how the contrast is way too darkened over the top on the S21 Ultra. The Note again isn't as sharp as the other two, and is really struggling with HDR, just look at the sky, so the S22 Ultra is the clear winner. Overall, there are definitely some really nice improvements with the S22 Ultra's camera. Portrait, zoom and selfies are fantastic, probably the best on the market right now. But so much of the camera is overshadowed by those softening and other weird processing issues. So much so that if I had to answer someone honestly about which of the three phones has the best camera right now, I'd have to say the S21 Ultra. So that's something to bear in mind if you're considering buying or upgrading. I know others have experienced these issues as well, but if you have one of the Snapdragon S22 Ultras, are you experiencing these camera issues too? I'd love to hear from you. So the S22 Ultra starts at $1199, the same price as last year, which we expected. But remember that there's less RAM this year, and the price increase to move from the base model to one of the higher RAM and storage options is considerably higher compared to last year. So I guess the other way to look at this is that the phone is actually more expensive this year. There's no doubt this is an awesome phone. The display is best in class, it's the fastest and most powerful Galaxy yet, and the most significant change is obviously the S Pen. Integrating this as part of the phone will be the deal breaker for some people, especially older Note users who can now view the S22 Ultra as the next logical upgrade. If you have a Note 20 Ultra, I'd personally say you should hang on to it for another year if you can, but there are clearly lots of improvements you'll notice with the display, speed and camera if you do upgrade now. But compared to the S21 Ultra, it's far less of an upgrade. As I said at the start, there are things that are straight up better on last year's phone. The design, okay, the aesthetics are subjective, but that screen curvature can be a problem, the vibration motor and speakers are weaker, and there are questions about the durability. Battery life, that's slightly worse, there's less RAM now, and as for the camera, well, we've seen a bunch of things wrong with the S22 Ultra's camera. I just think that the S21 Ultra is a better overall phone, so you should not only stick with it if you have one now, but you should definitely consider getting it instead of the new S22 Ultra, especially if, like most people, you don't care much for the S Pen. Not to mention, it's now heavily discounted in price, so unless you need that Note-like experience, I'm finding it pretty tough to justify getting the S22 Ultra instead. If Samsung could find a way to fix those camera issues through software, I feel like that could really change the narrative surrounding this phone, at least my view on it. But let me know what you think. Are you switching to the new S22 Ultra? And if so, which phone are you switching from? My in-depth review on the S22 and S22 Plus is coming very soon, including my thoughts on why you might actually want to go for one of those phones instead of the Ultra. I've also got the S22 Ultra versus iPhone 13 Pro Max coming soon after, so make sure you're subscribed to the channel and hit the bell icon so you receive notifications when those videos go live. Give this video a like if it was helpful, thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.